He hadn't spoken to another soul in over 5 years, not since Margaret passed and the mountains became his only company. Walter Granger, once a painter of rivers and ridgelines, now carved silence into wood one breath at a time. He wasn't running away from the world. He had simply stopped waiting for it to speak back. But then one morning, just as frost clung to the pines and the wind carried only memories, a sound shattered the silence. Not a branch, not a bird, a growl laced with pain. And there she was, a black bear, her leg mangled in rusted steel, her eyes pleading without words. Walter should have turned back. But something in those eyes, something ancient and aching, called to him. And what he did next would unravel everything he thought he knew about grief, about wilderness, and about miracles. Because days later, that same bear would return, not for food, not for vengeance, but with a gift that would lead Walter to a child half buried in snow, and a chance to believe again. The wind whispered cold and sharp through the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, brushing across pine trees dusted with the remnants of late winter. Nestled between two narrow ridges, far from paved roads, or the hum of town life, stood a small weathered cabin. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, rising into the pale sky like a memory escaping a dream. Walter Granger had lived in that cabin for 5 years. After losing his wife Margaret to cancer, he had quietly withdrawn from the world. Once a respected landscape painter with gallery shows from Asheville to Savannah, he had stopped painting for others. Now he painted only for himself, if he painted at all. Most days he tended a small vegetable garden by the creek, split wood, or wandered the surrounding forests with a sketchpad and a thermos of tea, searching not for inspiration but for stillness. He was 68 years old with a lean build that age had thinned but not broken. His white hair was usually tucked beneath a canvas cap, and his clothes smelled faintly of cedar and tobacco. Walter wasn't unfriendly, just unreachable. He preferred it that way. In a world that never stopped talking, he had chosen silence. That afternoon the light filtered dimly through the clouds as Walter followed a narrow game trail deeper into the woods. He hoped to find a new angle of the southern ridge to sketch before the snow melted. The air was crisp, the forest quiet save for the occasional snap of twigs underfoot or the rustle of a bird overhead. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to wind or bird. It was low and rough, somewhere between a growl and a whimper. Walter froze. His heart tapped faster as he listened again. The cry came a second time, carrying through the trees like a wounded plea. Carefully, he stepped off the path, pushing through underbrush until he came upon the source. Lying on its side beneath a tangle of fallen branches was a large black bear. Its fur was thick and dark, but its front leg was caught in a steel trap, old and rusted, its jagged jaws biting into raw flesh. Blood had soaked the snow beneath the bear. It groaned again, a sound full of pain. Walter stood very still. Every part of him told him to turn back. He was unarmed, alone, and face to face with a creature that could kill with one swipe. But he didn't move. The bear's eyes found his deep, dark, and wide with fear, but not rage. Slowly, as if moved by something he couldn't name, Walter dropped his satchel and stepped forward. He spoke low and calm, not knowing if the bear could hear or understand, but speaking anyway. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "Let's get you out of that thing." Walter stayed crouched in the snow, barely breathing, eyes locked on the bear's. The steel trap had clamped high on her front leg just below the shoulder. An old rusted model with serrated jaws half buried under crusted ice and dead pine needles. Her breathing came in quick bursts, sharp clouds of white that fogged and faded into the cold. He could hear the blood dripping slow but steady into the slush beneath her. Every instinct told him to back away, but he didn't. He reached slowly into his satchel and pulled out the half-loaf of bread, still warm in its wax paper, from the morning fire. He tore a small piece off and tossed it a few feet in front of her. She flinched, but didn't growl. Her nose twitched. Slowly, shakily, she stretched her neck forward and took the bread in her teeth. Walter tore off another piece and laid it just beside the trap. This time she hesitated longer before inching forward. Her eyes flicked to his, full of pain, but not hatred. He whispered gently, words not meant to soothe her as much as calm his own pulse. "It's all right, girl. Let's see what we can do." He took out a wooden wedge from his pack, something he used for splitting logs, and crawled forward, eyes never leaving hers. Her body tensed, but she didn't lunge. He slid the wedge between the jaws of the trap, found a nearby branch thick enough for leverage, and pushed. The trap resisted. His shoulders trembled with the strain. His boots slipped in the snow, but the metal finally groaned open with a dry, cracking snap. The bear yelped, recoiling violently. She limped backward, her injured leg barely supporting her weight, dragging a dark trail behind her. But she didn't run. She turned to face him again. Walter knelt in the snow, heart pounding, and held her gaze. In that stillness he saw it, something beyond animal instinct, something that felt knowing. He whispered again, "Go on, girl. You're free now." She blinked slowly, then turned and disappeared into the thicket, leaving broken branches and a heavy silence in her wake. Back at the cabin, Walter lit a fire and stared into the flames until the logs became glowing shapes. He didn't sketch, didn't eat. His mind replayed the scene again and again, the weight of the trap, the sound of her breath. Her eyes. He hadn't felt that alive in years. In town, 10 miles down the winding road and over 2 narrow bridges, Sheriff Dean Holloway stood outside the general store with a clipboard in one hand and a thermos of black coffee in the other. He was in his early 50s with a thick build that looked solid under his tan sheriff's jacket, a square jaw and salt and pepper stubble that he never seemed to fully shave. Dean had served in the Army before joining law enforcement and had a reputation for being fair but blunt. His dark brown eyes scanned the handwritten report he'd just received. A hiker had discovered a rusted trap on a public trail west of Bear Hollow. It wasn't the first one. They'd found 3 this season. He sipped his coffee and walked inside the store, where a woman in her 60s was arranging cans on a shelf. This was Glenda Moore, the store owner. She was short and sturdy, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a thick braid and a voice like gravel. Glenda had lived in this mountain town her whole life and didn't suffer fools. "Another trap?" she asked without looking up. "Near the hollow," Dean replied. "Same type. Barbed, looks like someone cleaned out their granddaddy's barn and decided to play hunter." Glenda snorted. "Someone's gonna get killed." Dean nodded grimly. "If it's not a person, it'll be a bear. Maybe already has." Glenda paused. "You thinking it's connected to that old painter up there?" Dean shook his head. "Walter Granger. No, he wouldn't hurt a fly. Lost his wife 5 years back. Keeps to himself. Probably talks more to pine trees than people." Still, the name hung in the air. Walter's cabin was near where the traps were being found. Dean made a note to swing by that side of the forest the next time he was out on patrol. Back on the mountain, Walter spent the next morning walking the same path again, hoping to catch a glimpse of the bear. He didn't expect her to return, but something in him needed to be sure. The trap was still there, lying open and blood-stained. He buried it beneath a cairn of stones, muttering a quiet curse against whoever left it. Then he pulled a small tin from his jacket salve for his hands and winter homemade from pine resin and beeswax, and left it on a flat rock nearby, along with a few pieces of bread. He didn't know if the bear would understand, but he wanted her to know he remembered. 3 days passed. Walter Granger spent most of them on his porch or walking the tree line near his cabin, eyes tracing the forest shadows for any sign of movement. The days had warmed slightly and the snow was beginning to recede in patches, revealing damp earth and mats of brown pine needles. His vegetable beds remained dormant, but he had turned the soil in anticipation more out of habit than hope. Yet every movement in the trees caught his attention. Every distant snap of a branch made him pause, wondering if the black bear with the wounded leg had returned. He hadn't spoken her name aloud, but in his thoughts he called her Sage. It had come to him without trying something about the quiet intelligence in her eyes, the calm strength. It was a name Margaret would have liked. On the third morning, as the sun began to rise behind the ridges, Walter stepped out to the porch with a mug of weak coffee. The wind carried the scent of melting ice and wet bark. He was about to turn back inside when he saw movement at the edge of the tree line just beyond the frost-laced ferns. Sage stood there, her black fur dull with dried mud and patches of snow, but her eyes clear and locked on his. Walter froze. His heart stuttered. She was limping, the injured leg still raised slightly, but she seemed steadier than before, and she wasn't alone. Flanking her were two smaller bears, cubs no older than a few months. One was darker, almost jet black, with a thick coat. The other with a faint brownish hue around its ears and paws. They were curious but cautious, clinging close to their mother's sides. Sage stepped forward, slowly, stopping halfway between the trees and the porch. Then, with a low huff, she lowered her head and dropped something to the ground. It gleamed faintly in the slanting light of early morning. A fish fresh and still wet, likely caught from Bear Hollow Creek. Before dawn, Walter stepped to the edge of the porch. Stunned, he didn't speak, just stared at the offering, then at her. The cubs stirred their tiny claws, twitching in the snow. Sage watched him in silence, as if waiting. He moved slowly, boots crunching over patches of frost, and crouched a few feet from the fish. It was a small trout, no more than a foot long, but its scales shimmered with iridescent silver blue. He picked it up gently, held it in his hand, and looked back at her. "Thank you," he whispered. Sage didn't move. The cubs pressed against her legs, one letting out a soft sneeze. After another moment, she turned and began to limp back into the woods, her babies shuffling after her like shadows. Walter stood still until they disappeared. That night, Walter grilled the fish over the wood stove, though he hesitated before placing it in the pan. Something about it felt sacred. He ate slowly each bite, reminding him of the moment they had shared. Afterwards, he took a basket of apples and nuts and left them on the same flat rock near the edge of the woods where he had once left the pine salve. He didn't expect her to return, but it felt right. In town, Sheriff Dean Holloway parked his cruiser beside the ranger's outpost just off the main road. He stepped out, brushing crumbs from his uniform. The sheriff was not a tall man, but broad-shouldered and rooted like the oaks that lined the riverbanks. His boots always looked freshly polished, but his eyes carried a permanent tiredness, part worry. Inside the ranger's station was dim and lined with old maps and laminated fire warnings. Behind the desk sat Travis Keene, a state wildlife officer in his late 30s. Travis was lanky, with a mop of red hair and pale skin that burned too easily in the sun. He had a habit of chewing on toothpicks when he was thinking, and he was chewing on one now as he flipped through a trail camera's SD card on an old laptop. "You said you had something?" Dean began. Travis nodded and turned the screen. "Last night." "Look here." The photo was grainy and monochrome, but the shapes were clear. Boot prints in the snow. Fresh ones. Not Walter's, Dean knew. These were deeper, larger, and headed north toward the preserve boundary. There had been rumors of poachers in the area, but no one had proof. Until now. Dean frowned. That's less than 2 miles from Granger's cabin. Exactly, Travis said. He's not the kind to set traps, but he might have seen something. Dean nodded. I'll check in with him tomorrow. Quietly, back at the cabin, Walter began a new routine. Each morning he left something on the rock fruit bread, even a small carved bear he had whittled from pine. Some mornings the offerings remained untouched. Other days they vanished. He never saw Sage again directly, but once, just before dawn, he spotted one of the cubs, clumsy and curious, tugging at the corner of the quilt he had left hanging on the porch rail. And he found other signs, paw prints in the softened snow, fresh scat near the creek, a patch of moss disturbed near the path. Walter didn't speak of her to anyone. Not because he feared disbelief, but because it felt like a secret shared between them. A quiet trust, born not from words but from wounds. That trust began to change something in him. He dug out his old sketchbook from beneath a pile of coats in the back room. The pages smelled of cedar and old paint. That night, with the cabin bathed in firelight, he picked up a pencil and began to draw. The storm arrived without mercy. Snow began to fall in steady flakes by late afternoon, thickening as dusk settled over the Blue Ridge. By nightfall it had become a curtain of white whipped sideways by fierce wind. Walter Granger sat near the hearth of his cabin, wrapped in a wool blanket, listening to the old beams creak under the weight of wind and time. The fire was steady, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. He hadn't seen Sage or her cubs in over a week, though he still left food at the edge of the forest each morning. The baskets were always empty the next day. He told himself they were surviving. He hoped they were. Outside, the storm grew louder. Wind clawed at the windows. Walter added another log to the fire and rubbed his aching knees. The mountain had seen many storms before, and he had weathered most of them alone. Then came the sound. It wasn't the wind. It was heavier, a scraping low and rhythmic at the door. Walter tensed. Few animals came this close. He reached for his lantern and stepped cautiously forward. When he opened the door, snow and wind surged inside, but standing there in the swirling cold was Sage. Her fur was rimmed with ice, and her breath rose in thick clouds. She let out a guttural growl, not aggressive, but insistent. Then she turned, took a few steps away, and looked back at him. Her eyes locked with his. Walter hesitated. He was old, his joints ached, the wind was cruel, but something in her look made his heart stir. She turned again, growled low, and waited. Walter grabbed his coat gloves and flashlight. "All right," he said softly. "I'm coming." He stepped out into the blizzard, following the bear into the woods. In town, Sheriff Dean Holloway sat behind his desk, the radio crackling beside him. Snow thudded against the station's windows, dull and constant. He looked up as a deputy handed him a message slip. Dean's eyes scanned the note quickly. His jaw tightened. Missing child, Cassie Rivers. Age 10, last seen. 2:15 p.m. He reached for his coat and radioed dispatch. "Get Travis Keene. We've got a search to plan." Walter followed Sage deeper into the forest. The storm clawing at his coat, the snow rising past his calves. His flashlight beam barely pierced the swirling white, but the bear's dark silhouette remained visible, a moving shadow against the storm's fury. The path twisted between towering pines, their branches groaning under the weight of ice. Walter's breath came in ragged gasps each step, a fight against wind and time. His knees ached and cold seeped into the seams of his boots, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Something about the bear's urgency. The way she kept looking back compelled him forward. Then Sage stopped. They had reached a small clearing where a massive pine had fallen, its trunk, cracked in half limbs, sprawled like broken arms. Beneath the arch of splintered wood, something moved small, fragile, almost buried in the snow. Walter's heart lurched. 2 children huddled beneath the fallen tree, barely visible under layers of snow and pine needles. One was a girl, her arms tightly wrapped around a smaller boy whose lips were pale and whose eyes were shut. She looked up as Walter approached her face, hollow with cold cheeks flushed red with frostbite. Tears had frozen in tracks down her face. "Help!" she whispered, barely audible over the wind. Walter dropped to his knees beside them. "I've got you now," he said, gently pulling off his coat. "You're safe." He wrapped the coat around the 2 children, checking for signs of life. The boy was unconscious but breathing, his chest rising in shallow pulses. The girl clung to her brother with stiff fingers, eyes wide, unblinking. "What's your name?" Walter asked, brushing snow from her tangled hair. "Cassie," she murmured, and "Ben. He's my brother." Walter nodded, jaw tight. He scooped the boy into his arms and helped Cassie to her feet, keeping a firm hand on her shoulder. She stumbled but held on, teeth chattering. Sage stood nearby, her breath fogging the air. She didn't growl or move, just watched them with calm, steady eyes. "Thank you," Walter whispered to her. Sage gave one final glance and then turned, slipping back into the white forest like a ghost. The walk back was a blur of pain and determination. Walter moved as quickly as the storm allowed, his body screaming in protest. With every step, Cassie walked beside him, supported by his free arm, her small boots barely clearing the snow. Ben remained limp against his chest, his weight growing heavier with each minute. When the cabin finally came into view, its chimney still smoking faintly, Walter nearly wept. He kicked open the door and staggered inside. The warmth hit him like a wave. He laid Ben near the fire on a pile of blankets and helped Cassie out of her soaked coat. She collapsed beside her brother, limbs shaking uncontrollably. Walter moved quickly, fetching towels, dry clothes, a kettle of water. He wrapped the children in layers and fed the fire until it roared, casting golden light across the room. Steam filled the air, mingling with the scent of pine sap and damp wool. As the kettle hissed, Cassie stirred. She looked at Walter with heavy eyes and whispered, "You're the man with the bear." Walter paused. "How did you? She brought you." Cassie said, "I saw her eyes. She wasn't afraid of you." He didn't respond. He just placed a hand on her forehead and nodded. Meanwhile, Sheriff Dean Holloway drove through the storm with both hands clenched on the wheel. His SUV crawled over snow-covered roads, headlights barely illuminating the trail ahead. In the passenger seat sat Deputy Ray Keller, a tall, quiet man in his 40s, with a bald head and permanent frown lines etched into his brow. Dean had followed a trail of shallow prints from the edge of the river's property, a faint but continuous set of boot tracks heading uphill, unnatural in this weather but clear enough to suggest someone knew where they were going. "I'll be damned if that's not Granger's tread," Dean muttered. Keller glanced sideways. "He's still alive up there?" Dean nodded. "Tough as nails. Lost his wife years back. Lives off rainwater and regret." "Think he's involved?" Dean's grip tightened. "I think he may have just saved 2 kids. They reached the edge of the tree line where the vehicle could go no farther. The rest would be on foot." Walter sat beside the fire, holding a cup of tea in his trembling hands. The children slept their bodies, finally relaxing under the weight of warmth and safety. Cassie had curled around her brother, one arm resting protectively over his chest. Outside, the wind had begun to die down. Snow still fell, but slower, now gentler. There was a knock at the door. Walter stood slowly and opened it. Dean Holloway stood there covered in snow, flashlight in hand. "Well," the sheriff said, his voice rough. "Wasn't expecting to find a miracle up here." Walter didn't answer. He just stepped aside and let him in. Dean looked down at the sleeping children, then back at the older man. "You really found them out there?" "I didn't," Walter said. She did. Dean's brow furrowed. Walter simply nodded. Outside the window in the distance between trees, a shadow moved. But when they turned to look, there was nothing but snow and wind. The storm had passed by, morning leaving the Blue Ridge blanketed in thick, unbroken snow. The trees stood heavy and still, their branches bowed in reverent silence. In the clearing outside Walter Granger's cabin, the world had gone quiet again, except for the thin ribbon of smoke curling from the chimney, and the faint sound of a child's laughter slipping through the logs. Inside, warmth bloomed from the stone hearth. The fire crackled. The kettle hissed, and the scent of pine wood and oatmeal filled the room. Walter, wrapped in a flannel shirt and old suspenders, moved quietly between the stove and a small table, setting down bowls of warm porridge. The children, Cassie and Ben, were seated side by side, wrapped in wool blankets, still pale but full of life. Ben, now awake, blinked sleepily at the rising steam. His hair was a tousled mess of gold, and he had a scar under his left eyebrow, likely from some earlier misadventure. He was 8, maybe 9, with the thin wrists and sharp cheekbones of a boy who hadn't yet outgrown his awkwardness. Cassie, 2 years older, had a steadier gaze. Her brown hair hung in tangled waves down her back, and her eyes, gray like early dusk, were clear this morning, though something lingered in their depth. Walter sipped his tea and studied them both. Neither spoke much, but the silence between them was calm, now not filled with fear. A knock sounded at the door. Walter opened it to find Sheriff Dean Holloway standing there, his coat dusted in snow hat, pulled low eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. Behind him stood a young deputy, Rachel McCoy, in her late 20s, with sandy blonde hair tucked beneath a green beanie, and a serious look that softened the moment she saw the children. Rachel had grown up in a neighboring town, the daughter of a game warden and a schoolteacher, and had a calm, practical demeanor that made people trust her without needing words. Dean stepped inside, removing his hat. Slowly, his gaze went immediately to the children. Ben waved timidly. Cassie looked up and managed a half-smile. Dean exhaled sharply and rubbed his eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "They're alive." Walter nodded. "Found them just before dawn." Dean looked over at Walter, something unspoken passing between them. "You always did know these woods better than anyone," Dean said, voice softer. Now, Walter's expression didn't change. He stirred his tea. "Wasn't me that found them." Dean raised an eyebrow. "You saying someone else brought you out there in the middle of a blizzard?" Walter hesitated. "Then a bear." Rachel blinked, surprised. Dean frowned. "Come again." Walter glanced at the children. "Big female. Black fur, injured front leg. She came to my door, led me straight to where they were." Dean was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down, hands clasped loosely in front of him. "You remember when I was 9, he said. Fell through the ice out behind Mill Creek. Walter's eyes flicked upward. You came home with a broken ankle, soaking wet and crying louder than the creek." Dean chuckled. "You carried me 2 miles on your back through sleet and didn't say a word the whole way. You never stopped talking, so I didn't have to." Dean shook his head. "My father always said you saved me. Called you a ghost in flannel." He looked over at Cassie and Ben. "Looks like you've done it again." Walter's voice was flat but sincere. "I had help this time." As they ate, Cassie looked up from her bowl. Her voice was small, hesitant. "It wasn't just snow," she said. "When I woke up, there was something next to me." Dean turned to her. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Cassie's fingers clutched the edge of her blanket. It was warm, like a big blanket. I couldn't see it clear, but it was a shadow. I think it was a bear. It didn't scare me. It curled around me like it was keeping me warm. Rachel stepped forward slightly, her voice calm. "You're sure?" Cassie nodded. "It was real. It felt Safe. Dean leaned back in his chair. Well, I'll be damned again. Walter remained quiet. Outside, the sun had begun to rise higher, turning the snow into a sea of glittering diamonds. Rachel stepped out first, radioing in the children's location. Dean lingered for a moment, watching Walter as he refilled the firewood bin near the hearth. You know, folks in town are going to think this is just a story, he said. Walter looked over his shoulder. Maybe, or maybe they'll believe something they forgot a long time ago. Dean tilted his head. What's that? That not all miracles come with thunder and trumpets, Walter said. Some come on 4 legs and don't make a sound. Dean smiled faintly. You ever think about writing all this down? No, Walter said, but I might draw it. The snow began to melt by the second week of March, leaving behind rivulets that trickled through the forest floor like forgotten lullabies. Beneath the pines, shoots of green poked through the damp earth and birdsong cautiously returned to the air. Winter had retreated, but it left behind something more lasting than frost stories. Word of what had happened at Walter Granger's cabin spread faster than the thaw. It started with the Rivers family. Brian and Eleanor Rivers, still shaken but overwhelmingly grateful, had spoken about the ordeal to everyone from the postmaster to the cashier at Harvey's grocery. What began as a quiet tale about 2 lost children turned into something deeper. Once Cassie whispered about the bear who saved her life. By the time the local church held its first spring gathering, the story had taken root. Walter, who had avoided town for nearly 5 years, found himself standing at the front of the church hall, one rainy Sunday afternoon. The pews were packed. Children sat cross-legged on the floor. Mothers dabbed their eyes before he even opened his mouth. Sheriff Holloway had asked him to speak not as a hero, he said, but as a witness. The church was a modest, white-paneled structure with stained glass windows that caught the fading sun. At the podium, Walter looked older than many remembered, his hair fully silver now, his frame lean and weathered. He wore the same flannel shirt he always had, sleeves rolled just above his wrists, the calluses on his hands visible even from the back row. I didn't do anything miraculous, he began. I just followed her. Murmurs moved like wind through the pews. Someone whispered, "The bear." Walter nodded. I don't know why she trusted me. Maybe it was something shared, a kind of quiet we both understood. As he spoke, children listened with wide eyes. One little girl clutched a crayon drawing of a large black bear beside 2 children under a broken tree. Another had drawn Sage as a guardian, spirit glowing in blue light, like something from a bedtime fable. Walter had never believed himself capable of stirring imagination, but here he was surrounded by it. After the talk, a boy named Eli Franklin, no older than 7, approached Walter shyly. Eli had curly brown hair, oversized boots, and a serious expression that didn't suit his round cheeks. He held out a small, crumpled paper. She saved them, he said, so I drew her a medal. Walter took the drawing. Sage wearing a golden medal labeled Forest Hero. He blinked twice before nodding. She'd like this, he said hoarsely. In the days that followed, Sage never returned, but her presence remained paw prints wider and deeper than any stray dogs appeared near the edge of the tree line behind Walter's cabin. Once he found a fish beside his doorstep. Another morning, the small wooden bear carving he had left near the trail was gone. He didn't tell anyone. Some things he believed were best left between souls. Sheriff Dean Holloway stood before the county council with a new proposal in hand. The meeting was held in the old courthouse, a tall brick building that smelled of paper and cedar wax with ceiling fans that still creaked from the 1940s. Dean, dressed in his neatly pressed uniform, glasses perched low on his nose, spoke with the gravity of someone who had seen the worst outcomes, and now finally a miracle. "I've seen enough traps in these woods," he said. "Rusty steel jaws buried in the snow, waiting to maim, not just animals, but hikers, pets, kids. It's time we act." He proposed a new initiative: Keep the Wild Wild. It called for a county-wide ban on non-regulated steel animal traps, harsher fines for illegal poaching, and the creation of community awareness programs that would teach children about wildlife preservation and respectful coexistence. Some members were skeptical, particularly Councilman Ray Trammell, a thick-set man with a red tie and a heavy drawl who ran a logging supply store on the edge of town. "You really basing a law off a bear?" "Story," Dean didn't flinch. "I'm basing it off 2 kids who came home alive. Off a town that remembered how to care. And off a tracker trail I followed with my own eyes. Something out there showed more humanity than some people I've known." The measure passed with a majority vote. Walter returned to his sketches, but this time he didn't draw trees or still lifes. He began with a rough sketch of Sage in mid-stride, one paw raised, head turned. Then he drew the cubs, clumsy and alert, one stepping over a fallen branch. Next came the clearing, the cracked pine, and the small bundled figures huddled beneath. He mailed copies of the drawings anonymously to the elementary school, the ranger's outpost, and the county library. He never signed his name. The last patches of snow clung stubbornly to the shadowed edges of the Blue Ridge as spring gave way to summer. Green overtook white, and the forest breathed again, moss unfurling on boulders, streams running freely beneath the ferns, and the scent of wildflowers rising with the sun. The air had softened. The woods were alive, and on the porch of a weathered log cabin tucked between the pines, Walter Granger sipped black coffee from a handmade mug and listened to the world. It had been a year, 12 months since the blizzard, 12 months since the bear with the wounded paw had changed everything. Walter had not seen Sage since the last thaw, but he still left offerings at the tree line, an apple, a fish, sometimes just a carved figurine. He didn't expect anything in return. Not anymore. It had become a kind of ritual, an unspoken prayer to the spirit of the forest, and perhaps in that quiet way she still lingered. The cabin had changed too. There were now drawings taped to the inside windows, colorful crayon sketches of trees and bears, and an old man with a crooked smile. Cassie Rivers and her little brother Ben had taken to visiting Walter once a month, sometimes with their parents, sometimes just the 2 of them with a ranger escort. The cabin, once silent and haunted by loss, now echoed with laughter and muddy boots, and the occasional shriek of, "Don't eat all the cookies, Ben." Cassie had grown taller in the year since the storm, her legs long and awkward, her hair kept in a loose braid. She still had that dusk-colored gaze, but now it was steadier, surer. Ben at 9 had grown bolder, too. He'd once been shy around Walter, hiding behind his sister's coat, but now he ran up the cabin steps shouting "Mr. Granger" as if the mountain itself had missed him. They called him Grandpa Walt now. No one had suggested it, but the name had stuck softly naturally like a seed finding the right patch of soil. The town of Elkridge, nestled between the valleys like a forgotten coin, had changed too. The sheriff's campaign. Keep the Wild Wild had sparked more than legislation. It had sparked community. Signs appeared near trails. "Respect what lives here." A ranger-led program began at the school teaching children to track animals without disturbing them. And this spring the town council had approved something new, a celebration. They called it Echo Day, a small festival held every May to honor the story that had moved them all a day, to celebrate the unexpected bond between man and wilderness. They hung banners across Main Street and filled the green behind the church with local vendors, student art, and picnic blankets. There was a bake sale face painting, and a storytelling corner where Sheriff Dean Holloway in his full uniform read from a picture book titled "The Bear, Who Followed the Wind," based loosely, though not too loosely, on Walter and Sage. Walter hadn't planned to attend. Crowds still made him nervous, and the idea of being watched like a curiosity wasn't something he welcomed. But Cassie had asked. "You don't have to talk," she had said, swinging her legs off his porch swing. "Just be there." So he'd gone sat on a lawn chair near the edge of the crowd, wearing a plaid shirt too hot for the weather, sipping lemonade and pretending he wasn't smiling every time someone handed him a drawing or offered him a cookie. Ben had entered the children's art contest with a clay sculpture of a bear holding a child's mitten. He'd won second place. Walter thought it should have been first. Late that afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the ridges and painted the sky in tones of gold and dusty rose, Walter returned home with a small paper medal around his neck and a satchel full of pine-cone crafts and thank-you notes. He sat on the porch with a fresh cup of coffee and let the evening settle around him. The woods beyond his cabin glowed with that particular kind of green that only exists when the sun is about to disappear. Birds called softly. The wind moved through the branches like a memory spoken aloud. He watched and listened and wondered. Somewhere out there he liked to think Sage still roamed. Maybe she had moved deeper into the mountains. Maybe her cubs had grown and scattered. But in his mind's eye she remained watching from the shadows, steady and silent. The guardian spirit of this place. He took a slow sip of coffee and smiled faintly. She had given him something far more lasting than a story. She had given him family. Sometimes miracles do not come with lightning or loud voices from the heavens. Sometimes they arrive on quiet feet covered in fur, carrying the warmth of the wild and the whisper of something greater. Walter thought he had lost everything: his wife, his purpose, his place in the world. But through the silent grace of a wounded bear, he rediscovered family faith and the reminder that God often works through his creation in ways we cannot explain. In our daily lives, we may overlook the small signs and act of kindness from a stranger, a child's laughter, or the calm that settles over us when we're surrounded by nature. But if we open our hearts, we may realize that God is present in those moments, too, guiding healing, and calling us back to connection with each other and with the world he made. So if this story touched your heart, we invite you to share it. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. Subscribe for more stories of love, hope, and redemption. And take a moment to thank God for the quiet miracles in your life. If you believe in the power of compassion and in the unseen hands of God at work, comment Amen below. May the Lord bless every soul who reads these words and remind us that no one is ever truly alone.